In the last few lectures, we learned about creating custom attribute directives in great detail. We also learned how to conditionally apply a directive on a DOM element in our previous lecture. Now, let's try to create some more complex custom attribute directives to make the concept more clear. So what we are going to do is, we are going to rewrite built-in ngClass and ngStyle directive in this lecture and in the next lecture. This will first of all help you understand how these built-in directives are written behind the scenes. But more importantly, it will help you how to think when implementing such type of custom directives for your Angular application. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and let's create our own custom ngClass directive. Let's go to VS Code, and here I have created a brand new Angular project. In this Angular project, if I expand this source folder, if I go to this app folder, in there we have our app component. So if I go to the HTML of this app component, there we have a simple h2 element and we have a div element. And in that div, we have a paragraph element. So this is a very simple HTML here. And if you notice on these HTMLs, we have not applied any CSS classes. But if I go to app component.css file, there I have defined three CSS classes: app container, app highlight, and app font. Actually, I'll call this CSS class as app highlight without any hyphen. Okay, and I'll tell you why I have done this. Let's save the changes. So currently, if I go to the web page, it looks something like this. Here we have our h2 element and we have our paragraph inside the div. Now, let me go back to VS Code. And if you remember how we use ngClass directive. So in order to use ngClass directive, what we do is first we specify a set of square brackets, and in there we specify ngClass directive. And to that, inside these double quotes, we can write some TypeScript expression. Now to ngClass directive, we always assign an object. And in that object, we specify the CSS class name as the property. So basically the CSS class which we want to use. In here, let me go ahead and let me use this app highlight CSS class. So we will specify this CSS class as the property of that object. And the value of that property will be basically a Boolean value. If the Boolean value is true, in that case, this CSS class, it will be applied on this host element. But if it is false, in that case, that CSS class will not be applied on the host element. Now here we are using hard-coded values like true or false, but here we can also specify some expression which will return a Boolean value. For example, 10 greater than 7. So this is a TypeScript expression which is going to return a Boolean value true. So since it will return true, this CSS class, it will be applied on this div element. So if I save the changes, if we go to the web page, you will notice that a CSS class has been applied on that div element. In the same way, if you want to use any other CSS class, for example, let's say I want to use this app container CSS class, again, we will have to specify this class name as the property of this object. So after this first property, we can specify second property, which is app container. Now here, this property name has a hyphen in between. But in JavaScript, you cannot have a hyphen in the property name. If you want to have a hyphen in the property name, you will have to wrap it within single quotes like this. Okay. And now we can use a hyphen in the property name when we have wrapped it within single quotes. And to this, again, we need to assign a Boolean value. In this case, let's say I'm going to assign true here. Again, you can also assign some TypeScript expression which will return a Boolean value. So now what will happen is, since this property's value is true, again, this CSS class will be applied on the host element. So if I save the changes and if I go to the web page, you will notice that a CSS class has been applied. Basically, using this app container, we are setting some margin and padding. So that margin and padding has been applied. Okay. So this is how ngClass directive works. To use ngClass directive, we wrap ngClass within square brackets like this, and to that we assign an object. In that object, the property name is the CSS class which we want to apply on the host element, and the property value will be a Boolean value. If the Boolean value is true, in that case, that CSS class will be applied on the host element. But if the Boolean value is false, in that case, that CSS class will not be applied on the host element. So what we want is, just like ngClass directive, we want to create our own custom app class directive. And this app class directive should work in the same way as this ngClass directive works. Let's see how we can achieve this. Now, just keep in mind, this is just for learning purposes. Here, I just want to show you how you can create custom attribute directives like ngClass and ngStyle. You don't have to create such directives for your Angular application. In your Angular application, you can use built-in ngClass and ngStyle directive. But just to show you how ngClass and ngStyle directive is implemented behind the scenes, that's why I have created this lecture, so that it will help you in implementing a similar kind of directive if you have such requirement in your Angular application. Okay. All right. So first of all, I will remove this ngClass directive from here. And what we are going to do is we are going to create a new custom attribute directive. But before that, inside this app folder, I'll go ahead and I'll create a new folder. I'll call it custom directives. And inside this custom directives folder, I want to create a class directive. For that, I'm going to use Angular CLI. And to use Angular CLI, I'm going to use VS Code built-in terminal. Okay. And currently we are in the project folder. From the project folder, we need to move to this custom directives folder. So for that, we will use the cd command. From the source folder, we want to go to app folder. And from the app folder, we want to go to custom directives folder. Now we are in the custom directives folder. Let me clear the terminal. And here we are going to type ng generate command. And we want to generate a directive. And we want to call this directive class. Let me press enter. And it should generate a class directive for us. So here you can see inside this custom directives folder, a class directive has been created. And for this class directive, a spec.ts file has also been generated. Let me go ahead and let me delete this spec.ts file because we don't need it right now. Now let's go to this class directive.ts file. In there you will notice that we have a class called class directive, which is decorated with directive decorator, and the selector is app selector. In there we also have a constructor. Now on whichever element we are going to use the selector of this class directive, we want to have a reference of that element inside this class directive. So for that, in the constructor, let's go ahead and let's create a parameter. Let's call it element. It is going to be of type element ref. And in order to use this element ref, we also need to import it from Angular/co. And this element parameter, it will be local to this constructor. But what we want is, we also want to create a private property called element. For that, in front of this element parameter, I will use this private keyword. And what it will do is, behind the scenes, it will create a private property called element. And that property will be assigned with the value which we will receive for this element parameter. Then I also want to use the renderer2 class here. So again, I'll create a private parameter. I'll call it renderer, and it is going to be of type renderer2. And again, in order to use this renderer2, we need to import it from Angular/co. Okay, so this is the constructor here. Now let's go ahead and let's create a property. Let's call it display. And what I want is I want to bind this property on the host element. So for that, I need to decorate it with @input decorator. And again, in order to use this @input decorator, we need to import it from Angular/co. So now what I want is I want to use this app class directive on this div element. So I'll specify that directive selector here. And then I also want to use this display property. I want to bind this display property on this div element. So in order to bind this display property, we need to wrap it within square brackets. Now keep in mind that since I want to use this display property here on this div element, first I will have to use the selector of the directive inside which we have defined this display property. If I remove this app class from here, which is the selector for the class directive, what Angular will do is it will search for this display property for this div element. But this div element does not have a display property, right? So in order to tell Angular that it has to search for this display property inside this class directive, first we need to use the selector of that directive. Then only Angular will look for this property inside this directive. And now to this property, we can assign any TypeScript expression. Now here, to this display property, just like how we assign an object to ngClass directive, here also we are going to assign an object to this display property. And in the object, we will specify the CSS class name as the property name. For example, we will specify this app container CSS class as the property name. And since this app container contains a hyphen in it, we will wrap it within quotes. And the value of that property will be a Boolean value. For example, let's say true. Then if I want to specify another CSS class, for example, this app highlight, again, we will specify it as the property of that object. And to that, we need to assign a Boolean value. For example, let's say false. Then let's say we also want to use this app font CSS class. Again, we will specify it as the property of that object. And to that, we need to assign a Boolean value. So for example, let's say 5 greater than 2. So this expression here, it is going to return a Boolean value, right? So to this display property, we are going to assign an object. And based on this object, we want to execute some logic. So for that, what we are going to do is, on this display, we are going to use a setter. For that, we need to use the set keyword. And when we use the set keyword, we can implement a property like a method. So in that case, here we can specify a parenthesis and a set of curly braces. In this parenthesis, we can specify a parameter. For example, let's say value. So when we are using this display property here, to this, we have assigned an object. So this object, it will be assigned to this value parameter. So here, the type of this value is going to be object, right? So inside this value, we are going to receive the object which we are going to assign to this display property. Now what we want is the object which we have assigned to this display property, we want to check its property name and its value. If the value of that property is true, we want to add that CSS class on the host element. But if the property value is false, in that case, we don't want to add that CSS class on the host element. That's it. So we basically have to check each of the property of this object and its value. If the value is true, we will apply that CSS class on the host element. But if the value is false, we will not apply that CSS class on the host element. Okay, let's see how we can do that. So we are going to write this logic inside these curly braces. So in here, first of all, what we are going to do is we are going to get each property and its value from the object. For that, what we can do is we can use object.increase method of JavaScript. And to this, we need to pass an object. And the object which we are going to pass here is the object which we are going to receive for this value parameter. Now, what this object.increase will do is it will return us an array. And in that array, we will have a list of arrays. Now, what will that array contain? Let me show you that. So let me go ahead and let me create a variable. I'll call it increase. And let's go ahead and let's log this increase in the console. If I save the changes, we go to the web page. Let me open developer console. You will notice that here an array has been logged. And in that array, we have 3 elements. And each element is also an array. And each of those arrays contains 2 elements. So the first element is the property name and the second element is its value. Okay, so first we have an array. This array has been returned by object.increase. And the elements of that array is also a list of arrays. And each array contains the property name from the object and its value. Okay, so what now we are going to do is we are going to loop over this array. And for each iteration, we are going to get its element. Each element is again going to be an array. From those arrays, we are going to extract the first element, which will be the property name, and the second element, which will be its value. Okay, so let's go back to VS Code. And here I'm going to use for of loop. So for let item of increase. Okay, let me go ahead and let me use this console.log statement. So I'll cut it from here. I'll paste it here. And I want to log item of 0 and item of 1. Okay, so for each iteration, what we are doing is we are logging item of 0. So this increase, it is basically storing a list of array. For each iteration, each array will be assigned to this item variable. Okay, so this item is going to store an array. From that array, we are extracting the first element and the second element. So if I save the changes and if we go to the web page, for each iteration, you will see that we have the property name at 0th index and its value at first index. Right, property name, its value, property name, its value. So what we are going to do is we are going to check if the value is true, then we are going to execute some logic. But if the value is false, then we are going to do nothing. Now value, we are going to get it from the second element, and the second element will be present at index 1. So this item of 1, it is going to give us the value of the property. So here what we are going to do is, let me go ahead and let me comment this console.log statement. And inside this for loop, first we will write an if statement. And in this if statement, we will check if the value is true or not. So we are going to get that value as item of 1. So if the value is true, then what we want to do is we want to apply the CSS class on the host element. And the CSS class name we are going to get as item 0. Right. So here, first of all, I will make use of a renderer class. So I'll say this dot renderer dot, and we want to add a CSS class. So I'm going to use this add class method. To this add class method, first we need to specify the element on which we want to add the CSS class. In this case, we want to add the CSS class on the host element, and the host element we are going to receive inside this element parameter. So here we will say this dot element dot native element. This is the first argument to this add class method, and the second argument will be the CSS class name, and we have the CSS class name inside this item of 0. So let me copy it, let me use it here. Okay, and with this, if we save the changes, currently the value for this app container is true, so this CSS class should be applied, and the value for this app font is true because 5 is greater than 2, so this expression will return true. So this CSS class should be applied on this div element. If you go to the web page, you will notice that those two CSS classes has been applied on the div element, but this CSS class, this app highlight CSS class, it has not been applied because its value is false. If I also set it to true, and if I save the changes and if you go to the web page, in that case, that CSS class has also been applied here. So in this way, we have created our own custom ngClass directive. Now, this is not complete yet. So let's go back. First of all, I want to change the logic here a little bit. So instead of using item of 0 and item of 1, what I'm going to do is from this item, I am going to extract the class name, the CSS class name, and the condition. So here we are going to use object destructuring syntax. And for object destructuring syntax, we use let or const keyword followed by a set of square brackets, because here we want to destructure an array. Okay, so here basically we are using array destructuring syntax, not object destructuring syntax. All right, and to this we need to assign an array. And we know that this item, it is going to store an array. So we are going to assign it here. Now this item array, it is going to have two elements. The first element will be the property name of the object, and the second element will be the value of that property. So inside these square brackets, we can create two variables. I'll call the first variable as class name. So basically the property name is the CSS class name, right? And the second variable, I'll call it at maybe condition. Okay, so we know that the second element of this item array is going to be a Boolean value. It will be either true or false. And now instead of item 1, I can use this condition, and instead of item 0, I can use this class name. So this is one change I wanted to do. If I save the changes, our application should still be working. If I go back to the web page, you can see the CSS classes are still applied. So it is still working. And another change which I want to do is, currently if you see on this div element, in order to use this display property, first we have used this app class directive, and then we are binding this display property. But if you remember, when we use ngClass directive, there we bind the ngClass directive directly. And we want to do the same thing here. So instead of binding this display property here, we want to bind this app class directive. And to that, we want to assign this object. How can we achieve that? Well, to achieve that, we have two ways. The first way is that we can rename this display property same as the selector name. So instead of calling it display, we can simply call it as app class. In that way, Since we don't have this display property anymore, we can remove it from here, and we can directly go ahead and directly bind this app class directive, because the property name also is app class only. So we can directly go ahead and we can bind this app class like we are doing here. So this should also work. If I save the changes, if you go to the web page, you see we don't have any error and the CSS classes are still applied. Another way is, if you want to keep the property name different as the selector name, so for example, if you want to keep it as display, it's okay. But in that case, you will have to provide an alias for this property, and that alias should be same as the selector name. For that, to this input, you can pass an argument, and there you can specify an alias for this display property, and this alias should be same as the selector name. So in this way also, we can bind the directive selector itself instead of binding a property. Okay, basically here also we are binding the property only. So we are binding this display property using its alias name. But since the alias name and the selector name is same, we can simply go ahead and bind that selector itself. Okay, with this, if we save the changes, we go to the web page, the directive should still be working. If I go ahead and if I change, let's say 5 less than 2, in this case, this expression will return false. And in that case, this CSS class will not be applied on this host element. So you will see that the font size and font family has changed because that CSS class has been removed from this div element. Okay, so in this way, we have created a clone of ngClass directive. Alright, so this is all from this lecture. I hope this lecture will prove helpful for you. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.